So we came to this tiny village on the mountainside. It's called Tamsurku. And my guide said that there was a refugee safe house where we could stay. Now, the authorities didn't know it was a refugee safe house, so we had to be very careful. There was a Nepalese policeman standing watch, and because they know it's a refugee route, and the Nepalese are paid by the Chinese to give up any refugees coming through. So already I'm beginning to get a sense of my story now. This is a little like Nazi Germany. This is like a sort of refugees coming out. This is like an underground railroad. And I'm beginning to sort of have an understanding of why I'm here. So my guy says, look, there's a knock on my door at like 12 o'clock at night. It's pitch black. It's freezing cold. I've never experienced bone-chilling cold like it. He said, look, I've found a group and they're willing to speak with you. You can't use their names, and you have to be very careful like what you ask them. We're going to have to go slowly, but they're willing to tell you why they've come over that pass. So like this is the safe house where I was. So we sort of crept out of our room, and there was a tent in the middle of a field. It was a nomad tent. We crept along a wall and we climbed inside, and like that was my first view. That's like what I saw. And I asked them like a little bit about where they were from, and I said, look, I've got one key question here. What are you running from? What's so scary? Now, this was in the run-up to the Olympics in Beijing in 2008. The papers were full of stories about China being a newly minted superpower, that it was like an up-and-coming democracy, that people were being lifted out of poverty, all these things. So, I'm playing devil's advocate as journalists do, so what's so bad? Like we saw the bird's nest being built, and there's going to be big fireworks and all this stuff. And they told me that, people were being snatched out of their homes at night. That just having a picture of the Dalai Lama, just owning one, gets you 5 years in prison. So like this seemed really extreme, and I said, okay, but I understand that, and so what are you hoping to get when you get to India and you make this really dangerous journey? And they said, all we want is an education. And it seemed pat at the time. I didn't understand. Like, what do you mean? Like, you want an education and you're like running for your lives? And I'd done some sort of reading on the way up, and you understand that when China invaded Tibet, it was back in 1950. The Tibetan cultural identity is very closely wrapped with Buddhism. So it's like a lot of communities in the US who are defined by their churches. Now, if you can imagine, and it's a very crude analogy, experts probably won't kind of like it, but I'll make it anyway. If Jesus Christ was still alive, living in Mexico, how many people would make that dangerous journey across the border into Mexico just to see him? So that was my frame of reference, being sort of raised as a Catholic. So I began to understand, and I began to understand too that the Chinese government, which is second now to the US economy, one of the most powerful nations on earth, was terrified of the Dalai Lama. They were terrified of anybody having any allegiance to anything other than atheism and the state and the power of the Chinese state. And really, to dominate a country, if you want to take over a country, the best way you can do it is to eradicate its history, to eradicate its language. And that's what the Chinese did. They said people weren't allowed to speak Tibetan. They weren't allowed to have any knowledge of Tibetan history. All that was stopped. And in the schools in Tibet, they're taught Mandarin, and they're taught the Chinese version of their history, which is that China is a benevolent country that came in and freed the savages and liberated them. So this is what they're taught. So the parents and the grandparents of the generation who remember what Tibet is like before that happened send their children over this high pass to escape and to get to India, where they can have a free education, where they can learn about their history, they can learn about their customs and their language. And you realize that, it blew me away, after 5 or 6 years in India learning their language and their customs, they go all the way back again. Because the Dalai Lama wants people to go back and to make sure that the language is still there and their history is still there. So this is a generation of people risking their lives for education. The picture here is just the sort of average daily scene that happens there when people go against the Chinese state. So this is a guy here who, I think he had a picture of the Dalai Lama, like the other guy. And he's facing it, so he's going to go to a labor camp. But I was intrigued. I was getting intrigued. So I was talking to these guys, and I said, "Oh, you know the reason I'm here? You know, there was a shooting here in 2006. A 17-year-old girl was murdered, and the brothers. There were 2 brothers and 3 sisters. And the 2 brothers said, well, the reason we're taking our sisters out of the country is because we were there in camp on that day. We saw that." And this is when you get lucky as a journalist. This is when you hit the mother lode, and you're like, this began to get very interesting now. And I asked these guys, and I said, well, like you had 100 Western climbers up there. They were climbing a mountain called Choyu, which is like a warm-up for Mount Everest. So a lot of these guys will use Choyu. It's known as not a technical mountain. It's easy to come up, but it's high, so you get an understanding of altitude. And so there were many people there warming up to do these Everest attempts, which they were going to be writing books about and doing speaking engagements and all these other things. Lauding themselves as heroes afterwards. So I asked them, and I said, well, you had 100 Western climbers there, some of the richest people in the world, because to climb these mountains costs at least 40,000. Everest is about 70,000. You have to take off at least, 4 months off work, plus all the training. So there's not many people who can afford this. So the people up there climbing these mountains are wealthy. So you've got wealthy people seeing refugees coming, and then you're seeing Chinese soldiers come running out, like with machine guns, and open fire on children. Some of these kids were as young as 5 or 6. So what was the reaction of the climbers? Like you can see here, here's a soldier, like escorting a child with his father. So I said, what was the reaction of the climbers? And the brothers laughed. They said, well, they're Westerners. They don't care. They come here because they just want glory. They want to stand on top of the mountain and shout and scream and say how brave they are, and they want to go home again. They don't want to get involved in our politics or the problems we have. So, and they said, there was a time 3 years before when another group came over the pass. The climbers were standing on Choyu in base camp, and a young refugee girl fell down a crevasse. Now, because that's a crevasse. Now, if you're walking on the snow, there's what's called snow bridges, and you cannot see these things, and then all of a sudden the ground gives way, like, and down you go. It's extremely dangerous. And so this refugee girl fell down that, and it's a horrible way of dying because your body heat melts the ice, and you slip further and further down. So the refugees were lowering down ropes, and they were tying their belts up, and they dropped tampa down, which is barley, which is what Tibetans eat on these trips. So they dropped barley down to this girl. And they asked one of the guys in the group to go to the Western climbers and to ask for help. The climbers had ladders, they had ropes, they had everything they could have used to free this girl. So they went to the Western climbers and they said, look, it's desperate, this girl is dying, we need your ropes and ladders. And the climbers looked at the guy and they said, we spent months training to climb this mountain. We have a very short weather window to reach the summit. But we can't risk it. We can't risk leaving that and the money we've spent on this to help this girl. Plus, we don't want to get involved in the politics of the region. We don't want to get in trouble like with the Chinese, because if we do that, we won't be able to come back. So the climbers carried on up the mountain. So I'm hearing this in the tent, and I'm beginning to get really quite angry at that point. I think this is when journalism can make a difference. So I hiked down. I flew to Dharamsala, and I met the Dalai Lama, and I told him what I'd seen. And, everyone who's met the Dalai Lama regards him as a sort of jovial, kind of caricaturish guy. And I told him what had happened. He got really angry. And he said it's a disgrace that people in the West and everyone else is not listening to what's happening in Tibet and China, and it takes these deaths to make people realize. And he said, look, when you write your story, just tell the truth.